Welcome to the Linden Hills History Study Group's virtual history program, Antisemitism in Minneapolis by Steve Hunegs. Steve has been Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas since 2006. Previously, he practiced law, including the Consumer Division at the Minnesota Attorney General's office, where he litigated consumer protection and cases and organized the Minnesota Older Consumer Anti-Fraud Campaign with the AARP and the Minnesota Crime Prevention Officers Association. Steve's work with the Jewish Community Relations Council finds him partnering to build coalitions. In his role, he has spoken out on injustices, including this summer when a couple in outstate Minnesota, protesting over wearing masks for COVID-19, they wore a mask emblazoned with swastikas, implying comparisons to Nazis and the Holocaust. In the October 18th Sunday Star Tribune, he co-authored an article with Steve Belton, LaJew Lang, and Jacob Milner. Their article is titled, "Democracy and Peace Among Americans Depends on Each of Us." It is a thoughtful, timely article. And then a 32-page insert was included in the October 25th Sunday Star Tribune, titled "Legends and the Myths of Ancient Minnesota." It is an artistic work of reproductions and the archival materials related to the Nazi following in Minnesota during the 1930s. Many Minnesotans were members of xenophobic, white supremacist, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigrant groups during the 20s and the 30s. It's important for us to reflect on our past, work to understand its history, and see how it compares to the times we are living in. I am pleased that Steve accepted the challenge to tell the story of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis. It is a topic that Linden Hills History Study Group has not previously specifically addressed. We appreciate learning more about these prejudices and injustices inflicted on our residents by our residents. With that, let me turn the program over to Steve. Thank you.
A good evening, Linden Hills History Study Group. I'm Steve Hunegs. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, here with my colleague Anthony Sussman, who's sort of at JCRC Mission Control. Also thank my colleague Sammy Rahamin, who helped prepare this deck for our talk tonight. I wish I could be with you. I wish we were in times of better public health. It's always a great pleasure to meet people, particularly those who are interested in the study of history. I was a history and political science major at the University of Wisconsin before I went to law school at the University of Minnesota. Thank you for your great interest in history and for inviting the JCRC and myself to talk with you tonight. And eventually we'll have a chance for some Q&A. And at that point, we'll have an opportunity to interact somewhat. Thank you to Joe Ellen. Thank you to August. Joe Ellen, you're a librarian, very close to my heart. The great defenders of civilization and freedom are librarians. We all know that. My grandmother was a graduate of the University of Minnesota, 1927 in library science. Gladys Applebaum, she was quite the lady. She had a driver's license, eventually went to Albion College in Idaho to be their librarian. And there she met my grandpa, who was a Jewish guy from a little town in Idaho, Murtaugh, Idaho. And they got married and moved back to Minneapolis. So that's the story, partially how I got to Minneapolis. August, I see you're a PhD and a photographer, also at the University of Minnesota. So we have two wonderful, highly educated people helping us deliver our talk tonight. So thank you very much. I'm going to be telling Anthony from time to time that I'll be moving the screen. I can't be trusted with technology myself, so that's the reason that Anthony is also helping me this afternoon. As ever, Anthony, thank you very much. Let's start with a little bit of the history that I read about the Linden Hills Study Group, History Study Group. Last November, you had a presentation on Ford Motors history in Minnesota, which is a long history. When I started my legal career at the Minnesota Attorney General's office, our office, the Consumer Division, law enforcement section, was in the Ford building on University Avenue, which I understand was at one time perhaps the corporate headquarters of Ford in Minnesota. Interesting about Henry Ford that he had a significant issue with anti-Semitism. That is, he wanted to have his own independent means of communication with people and eventually bought the Dearborn Independent newspaper, which achieved a circulation of about 900,000 by 1926, 1927. In 1920, and then again in 1922, he printed a number of articles under his own byline in which he alleged that Jews throughout the world were engaged in a global conspiracy. Anything he didn't like, he attributed to that conspiracy. Jazz, minorities, World War I, etc. But of course, this became very controversial and in many ways repeating age-old tropes of anti-Semitism, Jewish manipulation, Jewish control, and the like. He eventually, more or less, repudiated it and apologized in 1927 as a result of litigation. Nevertheless, it continued to leave, one might say, a wound, a sore in connection with Ford Motor and the American Jewish community for many years. Henry Ford Museum on its website says, tarnished his reputation and has never been completely forgotten, all of which is true. It's interesting to think about the time in which Henry Ford was printing his conspiracy theories about Jews, because he was probably more or less an equal opportunity hater in the sense that no minority fared well, at least at that time in the eyes of Henry Ford. But this was the time of the Palmer raids. This was the time of extreme nativism, agitation against immigration into the United States, the fear of the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the like terrible race riots in the aftermath of World War II in Chicago in 1919, in Tulsa in 1921. Volstead Act, Andrew J. Volstead, congressman from Minnesota, passed in 1919. Of course, that was in some ways targeted against ethnic minority communities, particularly those from Central and Eastern Europe, for whom gathering around celebrations and alcohol was an important part of the culture. So as we know, much xenophobia in the United States at that time. Didn't mean at the same time that there wasn't agitation in this country. It was a time of anarchist bombings. A. Mitchell Palmer, he of the Palmer raids, and Coolidge's attorney general, was in fact the target of a bombing attempt at his home in Washington, D.C. in 1920, and other anarchists, primarily bombing attempts throughout the United States, the Wall Street bombing too, and some of them were very bloody. So there was a time of great unrest in the United States. Not inconsistent with that ferment was Henry Ford, as he was worsening circumstances with the publication of International Jewel, The World's Problems, and that all relates back to the facts. See, it all connects in one way or another to the session that you had last year about Ford Motor in Minnesota. Interesting, I choose this little headline because so much is personal, particularly in a fairly tight-knit, smaller Jewish community like the Twin Cities. Smaller, I'm talking about some of the West Coast or East Coast or cities, or even Chicago. Many people in the Jewish community know each other, are related through marriage, gone to school together, whatever the case may be. Our neighbor, Ron Saxon Ford, dear friends of my parents. But it was very interesting all these years ago, must have been the 1940s, when the Saxon family, Ron, we call him Uncle Ronnie, acquired a Ford Motor dealership. So here was a situation where Henry Ford was deeply anti-Semitic, or at least published articles along those lines. Years later, Saxon family, Jewish family, acquires a Ford dealership. And just down the street from the old Ford building in St. Paul on University Avenue was their sort of landmark auto dealership, Saxon Ford. Now, that dealership is closed, but they have other Ford dealerships throughout the state, or throughout the Twin Cities area. Kind of, if you modify Tip O'Neill's statement, all politics are local, in some respects, all history is personal. Every story needs a centerpiece, or a place around which we will rotate. Talk about racism and anti-Semitism in the aftermath of World War II, 75th anniversary of the end of the war, because it was such an evocative, such a profoundly transformative experience, World War II, for all Americans. Center a little bit of my talk around the meaning of World War II, particularly veterans, for American Jews, African Americans, Japanese Americans, and the like, because that helped provide the fulcrum, the catapult for the civil rights reforms and the civil rights advances that were made in the aftermath. Start here. Jewish Welfare Board, even before the United States entered the war, began compiling records of American Jews in World War II. I mean, you can see it from the title, American Jews in World War II, the story of 550,000 fighters for freedom. Interestingly, the Jewish war veterans who are holding their 75th anniversary tonight, that is the St. Paul chapter of it, is the nation's oldest veterans organization. So this was something the American Jewish community took very seriously. Actually, if you think about it, the number of Americans, 16 million, who served, men and women, who served under arms in the Second World War. It was one of the great, maybe the greatest collective experience in the history of the United States, and communities that suffered significant discrimination, as I mentioned before, Native American too. This was an opportunity for them to demonstrate their Americanism while at the same time fighting abroad and confronting prejudice and racism at home. Again, everything's personal. On the left is my grandfather, Barney Applebaum, who owned a store, Barney's Market, 2221 North Washington Avenue North in Minneapolis, with a gentleman who would have been my cousin, who taught my mom to play tennis, Gerald Sonny Cohen. As you can see, Sonny's in uniform, home on leave. Presumably, he was killed in action, October 1944, in the Lorraine region of France, and he's buried at the American Military Cemetery in Lorraine. This picture, both of these pictures are behind my desk, and I look at them every day, but it demonstrates the supreme sacrifice of all Americans in World War II, and sociologically what that meant for the American Jewish community. It's a wonderful book that's been made into a documentary called G.I. Jew by Deborah Dash Morse, which is worth watching. This idea of World War II as a transformative experience, I wrote a piece in the Star Tribune last year, and Yank, which was the military magazine, military newspaper for the United States, had this interesting quote that the editor of it surveyed GIs what their goals were for the post-war world, and quote, above everything else, the need for wiping out racial and religious discrimination. So this is about 1945, 1946, again, underscoring the importance of the war effort for all minorities. About 325,000 Minnesotans served in World War II, about 7,800 lost their lives. So, Minnesota, of course, was deeply engaged in the war effort. Talk about other communities, other minorities who were participating in the war effort. This is an absolutely incredible poster. Think about the Japanese American experience, Nisei, that is the children of first generation Japanese Americans. We know the stories, the horrible consequences of racism and xenophobia and suspicion and paranoia involved in the internment of Japanese Americans in the Second World War. Nevertheless, despite being outright imprisoned in what some have described as an American version of concentration camps, they fought with absolutely remarkable heroism in the war. The 442, and this is a recruiting poster for the 442, was the most decorated United States Army detachment in the Second World War. 1,500 of the members of the 442nd were actually from the internment camps themselves. 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 21 medals of honor. Senator Daniel Inouye was a Medal of Honor winner, you may remember, who served in the United States Senate from Hawaii. Just an absolutely remarkable story, all while facing this profound discrimination in the United States. Locally, we had the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Fort Snelling and later at Camp Savage. Interesting because this brought a fair number of Japanese Americans to the Minneapolis, St. Paul area for training, because not all served in the 442nd or other units. Their Japanese language skills or their perceived capacity to speak Japanese and understand Japanese culture were also used in the military language schools, interpreters and the like. So we had this local connection to the Japanese American community serving the United States in the Second World War. Major General Willoughby, who was General MacArthur's Chief of Staff for Military Intelligence, says, quote, Nisei shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and possibly saved 1 million American lives and billions of dollars through their heroism for the United States. Interesting, Joe Allen, we started with this discussion of Carrie McWilliams, and the Carrie McWilliams quote that we use, that the study group is using tonight to promote this talk. And Carrie McWilliams, for people who may or may not know, was a very well-known author and editor, particularly in sort of muckraking pursuits, or we used to call them muckraking pursuits, exposing ugly sides of American life. And was reading more about him in the Korematsu case, which was the unfortunate, if not disgraceful, United States Supreme Court opinion giving the constitutional imprimatur to the internment of the Japanese. He had written a number of articles about the internment, sharply critical of it, particularly its underlying thesis that somehow the Japanese Americans presented a security threat to the United States. Justice Frank Murphy, who was one of the three dissenting, to their great and eternal credit, three dissenting Supreme Court justices who opposed the outcome in Korematsu, quoted Carrie McWilliams and his findings in his newspaper articles. Who was one of the other dissenters? Robert Jackson, who of course went on to become the United States lead prosecutor at the first International War Crimes Tribunal at Nuremberg. So all of these pieces, they all sort of flow together in one unified field theory. Carrie McWilliams as both the one who was an exposer, you might say, of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis, or at least chronicler of it at a national level, and then his work with the Japanese American community and exposing the extreme bias of the United States and the complete lack of foundation for the idea that the Japanese Americans were a national security threat, when exactly the exact opposite was true. Code talkers, Native Americans. The Japanese and the Germans could not figure out to break the codes. The Navajo, the Native Americans, Ojibwe, Nez Perce, Native Americans who were part of the code talking operations of the United States in the Second World War. So they played a very important role. The story was, when they came time to draft the young men of the Iroquois Confederation in upstate New York, the elders of the community went to the local draft board and said, "You will not draft any of our young men into the services." And they took this as somewhat of a provocation. And then the elders said, because all of them will volunteer for the United States war effort in the Second World War. Tuskegee Airmen is an exemplar of African-American participation in the war effort. Some numbers, 1.2 million African-Americans served in segregated units in the war. You might recall in 1941, FDR desegregated war industries. In 1947, President Truman desegregated the military itself. Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd writes, "Black war veterans, quote, had a great impact in the civil rights movement. If it wasn't for Black soldiers who came from World War II and the Korean War and lent their expertise to the cause, Dr. King and other ministers would not have been able to effectively organize as they did." So again, there's so much more that we could say about African-American participation in World War II, but it was a critically important font to advancing civil rights in the United States. American Jewish experience, where we sort of started this vignette about World War II. Here is a chaplain with Jewish soldiers outside of a synagogue, interestingly, outside of a synagogue in Germany, which had been rededicated. They're about to hold the first Jewish service in Germany since 1940 or 1941. But the role in the war in shaping American Jewish identity is hard to overstate, given the many ways in which it impacted American Jews, their service abroad, men and women, by the way, and when they saw the horrors of the Holocaust, of course, in Europe, how that influenced their view of themselves and their view of the post-war world, too. Here's a picture, again, all things being personal. This is my cousin, Bob Rotenberg, Uncle Bob, who passed away at the age of 92 last December. He served in the Signal Corps, China, Burma, India, CBI. The theater actually helped transmit the Potsdam Declaration after it was issued by the Big Three in 1945. So much of the American Jewish and Twin Cities Jewish experience is reflected in Uncle Bob. He served in the war. He came back, qualified for medical school, which at that time was quota. Jewish physicians were limited by quotas, or I should say Jewish medical students were limited by quotas at the time. Nevertheless, he was very determined to become a physician. He became a wonderful family practitioner in Northeast Minneapolis on Broadway. Rose Totino was one of his favorite patients over the years, and my cousins and I had a great time sampling her food before it ever went onto the marketplace. Interestingly, he would tell these stories, and again, reflective of the times, that sort of a de facto segregation itself in the University of Minnesota Medical School, and just the way that the 1Ms and 2Ms ate lunch. And generally, it was the Jewish medical students eating together. And there was another group of physicians that would, or medical students, pardon me, that would join them. And they were kind of the tech nerds of the time. And they would all sit together because, for whatever reason, they were sort of outcasts within the hierarchy of medical students. Well, as things would happen, some of these folks who were the tech nerds became the founders of Medtronic, right? And many of these Jewish physicians, Jewish medical students, and the folks who became so deeply enmeshed in Medtronic all became friends and were able to sort of realize some of the benefits of that relationship in the years that went ahead. Joel Glotter, another fascinating story, lived in our neighborhood. He was GI, World War II, participated in the liberation of the Ohrdruf concentration camp. And that's a whole story in itself, witnessing the horrors of the Holocaust through the participation and liberation of the camps in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia. It was deeply impacted all American soldiers who participated in the liberation of the camps. It just happened in this case, Joel was an American Jewish soldier from Minnesota who participated in the liberation of the camps. But sort of in the unified field theory of the world, Joel Glotter became an architect. With whom did he practice? The Liebenberg, Kaplan, and Glotter firm. What was Joel Glotter's expertise? Designing medical clinics. He designed my cousin Bob's, Uncle Bob's medical clinic. What's the meaning of this? We'll talk about job discrimination against minorities in the Twin Cities. One way that people, in this case, the Jewish community of Minneapolis, adapted was to start their own firms, Liebenberg, Kaplan, and Glotter. Liebenberg, Kaplan, and Glotter was a particularly well-known architecture firm, but they practiced amongst themselves. No, Jews weren't going to discriminate against each other in this sense, so they could, in a sense, band together for their own firm. And this was a nationally recognized firm, by the way. But Uncle Bob, when Uncle Bob would have graduated from medical school in 1950, 1951, whatever year it was difficult for Jewish physicians to find places to practice. So many began solo practices, just like my Uncle Bob did. And so here's a firm of significantly Jewish origin, the architecture firm, designing a practice for my cousin Bob, where he was a solo practitioner, because in those days, that is one way you could make a living as a Jewish physician, was to organize your own practice. Popular culture. Popular culture reflects so much of what's happening in this country. Gentleman's Agreement, fabulous cast, Gregory Peck, Dorothy McGuire, John Garfield himself, Jewish. This is the story of Gregory Peck as a journalist exposing, using that word yet again today, anti-Semitism, and his conceit in the movie as well as the book, Laura Z. Hobson's book, was he was going to pretend he was a Jew so he could discover the depth of anti-Semitism. And if you watch the movie or read the book, and all the places that he discovered it, and John Garfield was his great friend, his Jewish friend from the war years, and all the difficulties that Gregory Peck encountered during his time as a Jew. Interestingly enough, director Elia Kazan, who of course was named names in Hollywood before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which made him a very controversial figure in that time. Now you turn from this movie was made in 1947, Gentleman's Agreement, to Exodus, made in 1958, 11 years later. And again, prior to Gentleman's Agreement, anti-Semitism had been dealt with a very light touch in Hollywood. So many of the great Hollywood movie establishments and studios and the like had strong Jewish origins. Sometimes the people who founded those studios were reluctant to confront their own Jewish identity or issues involving the Jewish community. Exodus, 11 years later, is the story. It's based on a Leon Uris novel of Israel's War of Independence. Paul Newman is in the movie. Otto Preminger, who was a great director originally from Austria, has directed it. Max Reinhardt was Otto Preminger's mentor. Was a great Austrian Jewish playwright and musician, and the like. Sal Mineo, Eva Marie Saint, United Artists production. What's the meaning of this? Why am I talking about this? Because 11 years later, after a time in which Hollywood is very reluctant to discuss issues related to the Jewish community and anti-Semitism, suddenly have a full-blown movie about Israel's War of Independence with some of the most famous actors and actresses of the time. Wow, that's a real sea change in 10 years, less than half a generation, in the way that Hollywood is viewing culture in the American Jewish community and Israel. World War II, again, we saw Joel Glotter, who was a veteran of the European theater. Leon Frankel, a dear friend, someone else in whose neighborhood I grew up in, a remarkable story. Leon was a naval aviator in the World War II in the Pacific, 67 carrier landings, won 2 distinguished flying crosses and a Navy Cross, highly, highly decorated. Someday, I recommend it to you, go see Nancy Spielberg's documentary Above and Beyond, which is the story of the 101 Air Force, that is Israel's squadron in its 1948 war, comprised primarily of foreign volunteers like Leon Frankel. Remember, we talked about at the beginning the Jewish Welfare Board. Well, 1947, 1948, the Yishuv, the pre-state community of Palestine, realized that they were going to have to fight for its independence. They would have to organize an air force. There were a few Palestinian Jewish pilots who had fought in the British Air Force in the Second World War, but not many. So they had to go abroad to find pilots. And one way they did it was to go through the records of the Jewish Welfare Board. One of the persons they found was Leon Frankel from St. Paul. And Leon ended up flying 25 missions at great risk in Israel's War of Independence. So he is a hero of the Second World War and a hero of Israel's War of Independence and a remarkable person. All this is by way of backdrop to the great movie theater of North Minneapolis, owned by the Lebedoff family, of what American Jews and African Americans and others were facing by way of prejudice. Here are some statistics from the Roper polling, which at that time was the leading polling entity of social norms or social mores or social constructions of the time. Half the population, this is polling done during the war and after the war, half the population perceived Jews as greedy and dishonest. 56% believed Jews had too much power. 1/3 were anti-Semitic, and 35 to 40% would have approved an anti-Semitic campaign against Jews. Those are remarkable figures. Anti-Semitism actually peaked during the Second World War. So if you see the stories of American Jewish veterans of the Second World War, they were having to confront serious anti-Semitism. Of course, they were motivated to prove their bona fides as Americans in the face of this anti-Semitism through their World War II experience. And then the establishment of the State of Israel, too, people like Leon Frankel, an American Jew as a volunteer in the war, going back to the movie poster we saw for Exodus, also changed American Jewish attitudes about themselves and Jews throughout the world, but also impacted the way that non-Jewish Americans, viewed the American Jewish community and Israel in the vein of the existence, the creation of the State of Israel and its history. This is, again, as I said, the Holman Theater. In the war, and this goes to sort of the prevalence of anti-Semitism, even as the war was being fought. This was a propaganda leaflet that would be dropped on American soldiers, and you can take a quick look at it, and you can see its piece. What it was trying to sow discord and unrest and lower morale in American forces by following the line of Hitler and the Nazis that America was fighting a Jewish war. So you can see the point of this leaflet was, and this is also behind my desk every day, to point out that purportedly America the Jews controlled America. Not unlike what we saw from Henry Ford and the like. The prevalence of these tropes over time, whether it's Nazis, whether it's Henry Ford, very powerful at the time. Again, more motivation why American Jews wanted to serve, to prove their bravery, and also to disprove this canard that somehow the Jews were disloyal to the United States, if in fact not leading the U.S. to war. Part of the underlying zeitgeist of the United States at the time. Just sort of prior, bringing this up to modern day, JCRC has a wonderful relationship with the National Guards of Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota. Our transfer of memory exhibit. This is a picture of it. Was at Camp Rapid in South Dakota last September. Transfer of memory. It's exhibits of portraits, beautiful color portraits of the survivors of the Holocaust who came to live in Minnesota. It's traveled all throughout the upper Midwest, including Camp Rapid in South Dakota. Actually, it became part of their September 11 commemorations at Camp Rapid. And the gentleman in the middle is the Lieutenant Governor of South Dakota, Larry Roden, whose father was a concentration camp liberator. American Jews, this is Irene Levin, who is the mother of our current board chair, Judy Cook. She was a wave in the Second World War. So we talked about men and women serving in the Second World War. Big year, important year, 1947. You can see President Truman with members of Congress and others during the signing of 1947 Civil Rights Act, or I should say, receiving the recommendations of the Civil Rights Committee. They call the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1947. And if you could see it clearly, you could tell that fairly modest pieces of legislation that were being sought. Nevertheless, they were seen as groundbreaking for the time. Interestingly, you can see number 10, settling the evacuation claims of Japanese Americans. But you see establishing a Fair Employment Practices Commission, right to protecting the right to vote, federal law against lynching. Believe it or not, that was always a sticking point in legislation, was passing a federal law outlawing lynching, creation of a civil rights commission, and the like. So these were sort of modest by our view, but more groundbreaking in 1947, the goals of the civil rights movement. Hubert Humphrey, actually elected mayor in 45 after losing in 43. This is not Hubert Humphrey, but I always loved it as a way of campaigning in 1947 because he's running for re-election. How times were simpler back then. No internet, no ubiquitous advertising everywhere you went, but someone riding down the street in a scooter with a re-elect Humphrey banner. But Humphrey was elected mayor in 45 with the significant backing of the African American and Jewish communities. You can see pledge for American unity here, and Humphrey supporting it. You can talk about his support, the dignity of all Americans, and how strongly that resonated in the African American and Jewish communities. What does that mean? Let's unpack that for a minute. 45, 46, 47. First of all, the Cold War is gaining strength, you might say. The United States is in competition with the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, we have Jim Crow throughout the South and in the North. After all, Brown versus the Board of Education was a case that arose out of Kansas. Secondly, let's turn the spotlight on Minneapolis, the Carrie McWilliams quote. The level of social exclusion against Jews, Japanese Americans, and African Americans, which is what brought Carrie McWilliams to Minneapolis, was extensive. So much so that Jews and African Americans could not even join the AAA in Minneapolis. Why was that? Because the AAA maintained a country club in those days, and people did not want to be in the presence of Jews or African Americans and eating lunch or breakfast or dinner with them. Held true for housing, held true for many different aspects of life, public accommodations, in the words of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Humphrey appreciated the fact, a couple of things. One, it's just outright wrong. Two, but is retarding the economic development of Minneapolis. And you also have to think about that. The city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, upper Midwest, was on the cusp of a huge growth spurt because the war, particularly at the University of Minnesota, had provided so much expertise, research. People may not appreciate the fact that Minnesota, ending the war, 1939, 1940, was a relatively poor state on practically every standard, trailing Wisconsin, for instance. But during the war, particularly after the war, Minnesota exploded, significantly based on medical technology, the strengths of the University of Minnesota, a business community that was progressive minded, the Coles family, the Dayton's family, etc. Humphrey tapped into that spirit too. How can we continue to move forward economically if we're in many respects a segregated city, whether it's by religion or whether it's by race? And he found a lot of support amongst the business community, labor unions, religious groups, civic organizations for his vision. Indeed, in 1947, Minneapolis becomes one of the first cities to pass anti-job discrimination, anti-housing discrimination ordinances, that is applying to the city of Minneapolis in the entire country, 1947. What happens 17 years later, Hubert Humphrey is now in the United States Senate, practically from the time he's elected to the Senate, 1948, taking office in 1949. He's working on civil rights. Justice Brandeis called the states, in this case we'll call it the city, the laboratories of democracy. Much of what Hubert Humphrey learned as mayor of Minneapolis with the establishment of the FEPC and the anti-job and anti-housing discrimination ordinances, he took with him to Washington. Of course, it's a much larger picture than that. Nevertheless, Humphrey was one of the pioneers, was one of the foundational advocates for 1964 Civil Rights Act for the United States. And this is very much the story of the entire city of Minneapolis, African-American, Jewish, and all those who joined together at that time to help elect Humphrey and then to help Humphrey's vision become reality. Going back to this piece, again, 1947 is another critical year in the eyes of Jewish history. Palestine is partitioned into Jewish and Arab states by the United Nations, November 29, 1947, which, as I explained before, sort of had its own ramifications as it led to the Declaration of Independence in Israel in 1948 and helped sort of reset people's views of Jews in the United States, people's views of Jews, rightly or wrongly, throughout the world. So that's one of those seminal events, you might say, in history and including in Jewish history too. Again, always like to return to Hollywood as a reflection of the United States. Again, here is a movie called Casted, Giant Shadow, with Kirk Douglas, recently passed away. He's playing the role of Mickey Marcus, who a little bit like Leon Frankel, because Mickey Marcus was an American blue blood in the sense that he's a West Point graduate paratrooper lawyer in the Second World War. And he was convinced to bring his expertise like Leon Frankel did, except in this case to the nascent Israeli army, the Haganah, in the 1948 War of Independence. And he was actually killed accidentally by his own sniper because Mickey Marcus did not speak any Hebrew, did not understand what it was that he was being told to do, which stopped. The point being now, by this point, early 1960s, movies about Israel, movies about Israeli independence, movies about Jewish officers going over to serve in Israel's 1948 War of Independence are the stuff of box office success. Quite a transition from where Hollywood was and the American Jewish community was only half a generation before. We were founded in 1939, an organization to fight anti-Semitism. These days, and I'm pleased to say this, that significant, if not 80, 90% of our work is characterized almost by philo-Semitism. That is, people wanting to work with the American Jewish community, Minnesota Jewish community, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota Jewish communities with 225,000 square miles of paradise, as I like to say, on all sorts of different and important community pursuits. It's amazing how things have changed in these preceding 75 years since we were founded, which is all for the good. You can just see we're not going to get into a long discussion now of the bases of anti-Semitism and how it's been manifested over the years, but you can take a look. A good shorthand way is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, remarkably brilliant, prolific author and former chief rabbi of Britain and the United Kingdom, who's written a book a year for about 25 years, said it this way. He said, first Jews were despised for their religion, that is, as a monotheistic religion. Then they were despised for their race, the the bogus theories of race that were advanced in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries about Jews, and then for their state about Israel. And each one of these tropes, as they're said, has their own history and their own mechanisms and the like. But particularly the Jew as the controller, as the puppeteer, is one that has had resonance through the centuries, if not through the multiples of centuries. And you can see it throughout time, whether it's Henry Ford or whether it's before or after Henry Ford as the place where we started this discussion. Again, having to come home, talking about Henry Ford, something even closer to home, and talking about the idea of the Jew as the conspirator, the international conspirator. Who is this a picture of? Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh, the man who single-handedly changed aviation, or international aviation, trajectory through his 1927 flight from Long Island to Paris, and became one of the greatest heroes ever practically overnight. Incidentally, his father was Charles August Lindbergh, was a member of Congress from Minnesota for 10 years, 1907 to 1917, voted against the United States entrance into World War I, something of a pacifist. Lindbergh, complicated, multifaceted personality, was an early exponent of environmental protection. Interestingly enough, in fact, he dedicated much of his life after World War II to environmental protection. Author, many other redeemable features about him. Of course, he also volunteered in World War II in the South Pacific. FDR wouldn't give him a commission. He was so angry with him for his pre-war activities, but he helped save American airmen's lives in the Pacific theater in the Second World War because he found his way into combat and was able to make all sorts of suggestions about improving the performance of American aircraft. But he's got a really ugly preface to all of that, and that is he became very much almost consumed with the America First Committee. He was more or less its spiritual leader. General Robert Wood was its executive director. But to show you what life was like in pre-war United States, he gave a speech on September 11, 1941 in Des Moines, on national radio, WHO radio station in Des Moines, in which he said the FDR, the Brits, and the American Jewish community were leading the United States to war against Germany. And then he said Jewish control of the press, Jewish control of the radio, Jewish control of Hollywood was aiding and abetting this. And it's almost hard to imagine such a speech given by a prominent American, what that would look like even today. He had a national platform in which to expose. So everything we talk about in post-war is strongly influenced by a culture, by a community in which this could occur. It's a whole sidebar story, a whole fascinating story in and of itself. Our founder of our organization, which was then called the Jewish Anti-Defamation Council of Minnesota, Sam SCHEINER, who was a person upon whose shoulders we stand, GI, lawyer, founder of the organization all those years ago when he had practically no resources, fighting manifest anti-Semitism, as we've been discussing. He directly challenged Lindbergh, which took tremendous courage in the day, writing to General Wood in this letter that I found in our archive at the Minnesota Historical Society, and challenging Wood to disavow Lindbergh. And Sam was very good at what he did, very sophisticated understanding of the press. If you look at the file, you'll see that there are many clippings from newspapers that picked up his challenge. And in fact, but a couple days later, Pioneer Press published an editorial called Imitator of Hitler that was expressing complete disdain and outrage and disgust about what it is that Lindbergh had to say. So while we talk about anti-Semitism, the large amount of anti-Semitism in the United States during the war, there were also Americans of goodwill and prominent Americans of goodwill who were opposed to anti-Semitism in this country. Minnesota being one of the areas where internationalism versus isolationism was most fiercely contested, as you can tell, Lindbergh coming from Minnesota. On the other hand, you have the Coles family in the newspapers, and the Des Moines Register and the Minneapolis Star and the Minneapolis Tribune, who were internationalist newspapers. So much of what you see, the shaping of the post-war world, occurred right here in Minnesota. All the more important, the story that we're telling about African American and Jewish communities fighting anti-Semitism and racism. Here's something Kirsten Delegard, who is a professor at the university, John R. Borchert Map Library is her home base at the university. And she is remarkable in her research. The story that she tells about the discrimination against African Americans helps underscore that which the African American community faced, much more than the Jewish community. Restrictive racial covenants were outlawed on the basis of religion in 1920 in Minnesota. So it was not as nearly as significant a factor in housing, in the history of housing in Minneapolis against Jews as it was against African Americans. Nevertheless, there were many other ways you could discriminate against housing besides inserting it into inserting covenants into housing deeds, right? And so it was something that both Jews and African Americans faced, but more manifest against African Americans. And I need not say much more about her other than profound thanks to her. Now their work is spreading into Ramsey County, where they're conducting similar research. Like, I think two statistics I always think about in mapping prejudice, one of which is that houses that were the subject of restricted racial covenants are worth on average 15% more than houses that did not bear the covenants. In other words, the ones that did not bear the covenants were in less desirable neighborhoods. And to this day, the disparity in home ownership in the Twin Cities between African Americans and whites is amongst the highest in the country. It just goes to show you the legacy of discrimination in Minneapolis. Great partnership. We talked about Hubert Humphrey fighting discrimination and prejudice in Twin Cities with people of goodwill. Well, two of the folks that were most deeply engaged, one of which is Sam Scheiner, whom we've met before, and what I had to say about him, but his great partner and friend was Cecil NEWMAN. In our archive, there's a tremendous amount of correspondence between Mr. NEWMAN and Sam. Cecil was a newspaper man. He was the founder or Minneapolis spokesman, St. Paul Recorder. He was the grandson of slaves. He worked early in life as a railroad porter before he became a newspaper publisher. He was an early president of the Minneapolis Urban League. In fact, the first African-American president of the Urban League in 1948 or 1949, meanwhile maintaining his newspapers in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. Not completely sure when Cecil slept in life, but these two forged a long-standing, Sam, Mr. Scheiner and Mr. NEWMAN, I'll just call them by their honorariums, you might say, were two people whose friendship helped create a new reality, particularly in Minneapolis. Interestingly, the Terry McWilliams piece was called Minneapolis, the Curious Twin, because the level of prejudice and discrimination in St. Paul was not nearly as great as it was in Minneapolis. And that was one of the reasons Terry McWilliams came, was to understand the difference between St. Paul and Minneapolis, just a whole different story for another day. But suffice it to say that this was one of the great stories of African Americans and Jews working together for the betterment of the community. It wasn't unique to Minnesota or Minneapolis, because this was often a partnership in many communities to fight discrimination and Japanese Americans and other groups that were discriminated against too, which is not to say that there weren't tensions between the Jewish community and the African American community over the years. Amongst cooperation, there were always points of disagreement, or sometimes there were points of disagreement, and some of those became very deep cleavages over time. It's interesting that Mr. NEWMAN was the president of what was then the Minneapolis Urban League. One of my closest friends and colleagues in our work, and I'll say in our work, is Stephen Belton, who is the president and CEO of Urban League Twin Cities, recently merged between St. Paul and Minneapolis. Indeed, we had a piece in the Star Tribune of last Sunday called "Peace in America Depends on Each of Us," and it was a piece, again, sort of talking about legitimacy, elections, decency, how we treat each other, and the like. Not different from the themes that might have been sounded in 1945, 1946, 1947. signed by myself, signed by Stephen, signed by Jacob Milner, the American Jewish Community local representative, and by Judge Lejeune Lang, retired African-American judge of the Hennepin County District Court. Again, we want to continue this relationship between African-Americans and Jews in the public space, particularly over something as important as civility, who are the first to suffer oftentimes during the course of coarse behavior, and if not worse, violence, or the elections in which no good faith is presumed on anybody's part. It is minority groups, and we all have a role as Americans, as Minneapolitans, as people who live in Linden Hills or wherever they may live in the Twin Cities, to strengthen ourselves by demonstrating good civic behavior and discussing difficult issues in a way that's respectful and civil towards each other. And our organization's coming together to write this piece. And thank you to the Star Tribune for publishing it on a Sunday in the hard copy. It's something that we want to target as an important goal for the greater community. We can talk about institutional anti-Semitism. Here's where I like to pivot to something very positive, and that is this. Jewish physicians, for instance, had a difficulty with hospital privileges. So the Twin Cities Jewish community decided that it would build its own hospital in a way, but that's sort of a crass way of saying it. Develop a hospital that would provide privileges to any medical professional, which met its standards, and would serve anybody. It hardly seems like a radical proposition these days, but when the fundraising began for Mount Sinai Hospital, it was sort of a groundbreaking achievement in the time. And I remember talking about my cousin Bob Rotenberg and other Jewish professionals having to establish sort of their own practices. Well, this is sort of the converse of it. The idea that we should develop an institution where all are welcome, and that this is a way we could give back to the community, combat anti-Semitism, and provide, in this instance, medical facilities and opportunities for practitioners of all backgrounds, so that all people could be treated if this is the place they chose for their hospitalization. Now, sometimes there are special people in life, and one of those would have to be Fred and Judy Barron. Fred passed away in 2014. He was from Vienna. Judy Kenahora, as you say in Yiddish, is still with us. But sort of bring things full circle, both were survivors of the Holocaust. Both met in Sweden. The Swedish community took in some thousands of Jews for rehabilitation after the war, and the two of them met in Sweden. What's so sweet about the story is they made their way here. They're part of our transfer of memory exhibit as survivors of the Holocaust. But interestingly, and I wasn't able to get into my office because here I am at home, somewhat quarantined for a COVID-19 reason in our family. Fred gave me his pleadings, you might say, from the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, that had been established by HUBERT Humphrey, as we discussed, in 1947. He, as a Jew, facing discrimination as he came here, having survived the Holocaust and come to Minnesota, and the difficulties he had at first finding a job. And Fred was resourceful and not one to take no for an answer. So he approached the FEPC about a couple of the instances in which he was more or less outright told he would not be hired because he was Jewish. And it's fascinating material to read how Fred, the Holocaust survivor, used his rights under the Minneapolis City Ordinance and the establishment of the FEPC to advance his interest and ultimately a community interest. People should know, speaking of Sweden, that something to look forward to, and we're trusting that public health will be better by next summer. The American Swedish Institute, my dear friend Bruce Karstad, its executive director of the JCRC and Bethel Synagogue, are bringing to Minneapolis an exhibit about the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was the rescue of 10,000 German and Austrian Jewish children, primarily to Britain, but some to Sweden, at a time when our country would take in practically very few refugees per the refugee quotas, and a bill that had been sponsored in the Senate and the House to bring in 10,000 German and Austrian refugee children could not even get a hearing in the United States. The Brits and Swedes took in, as I said before, about 10,000 children, Jewish children, before the war. There's a whole body of literature and documentaries about Jewish children, heartbreaking scenes of parents having to choose which child. And of course, for many parents, many children never saw their parents again who perished in the Holocaust. So there's an exhibit coming, an exhibit of the Leo Baeck Institute and Yeshiva University and American Swedish Institute and its beautiful campus on Park Avenue in Minneapolis is hosting it for 3 months. We're going to do a lot of programming around it. And I know these days with winter approaching, we're all concerned about public health, but we're trying to look towards a more positive future. And this exhibit and the programming and learning that will take place around it, and a great thank you to the American Swedish Institute for the partnership. So just a sign of how far that we've come. Anti-Semitism, so many of the pieces involving anti-Semitism. Of course, we're facing all sorts of difficult issues these days with anti-Semitism involving violence against Jewish institutions. The last couple of years have seen attacks on synagogues, as people have well known, well beyond anything that we've seen for many, many years in the United States. And certainly invokes our JCRC community security portfolio. But many of the sort of the badges or the indicia of discrimination have waned so significantly in American life. All of these dots that you see below are significantly decreased. I only hope we could say such a thing for discrimination against other communities, particularly the African American communities who have not had the benefit of such significant advancement over time. And that sort of sets our goal of the work that we need to do going forward as a community. If you're looking for resources about Jewish history in Minneapolis, here are 3 wonderful books. Outstanding authors. Professor Berman has passed away. Sadly, book on the right is a favorite. Only goes through about 1956, but practically anything you want to know about the Jewish history of Minnesota pre-1956, you can find in Rabbi Plaut's book. Rabbi Plaut was the senior rabbi at Mount Zion, state's oldest synagogue, dating back to 1848 for many years. He himself came over from Germany before the war on a program of the Hebrew Union College, which was able to bring to the United States a number of German Jewish seminarians, you might say, who graduated from the Reformed Seminary in Cincinnati. One of those was Rabbi Plaut, who lived to be 100 years old, and up until his 90s was still officiating in defense for Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto. He actually married my in-laws, Joellen and Stan Robbins, too. So a great story in Rabbi Plaut. Something else, if you want to know all about the anti-Semitism of the era in which we're discussing, Michael Rapp probably has written the definitive account, about a 300-page thesis on anti-Semitism in Minneapolis, down to a very granular level. I have it in a 3-ring red binder back at my office. You might say it's sort of a rite of passage that we pass along from JCRC executive director to JCRC executive director. We've only actually had a handful in my time between Sam Scheiner and Mort Rywick and Jay DeCath and Steve Silverfarb and myself and Brenda Berry too. So in all these 75, 80 years, only 6 executive directors of the JCRC. But Michael Rapp, who later became the executive director of the JCRC in Cincinnati, has written the definitive account for people who would like more information. Kind of at the bad old days, William Bell Riley show you sort of the depth of anti-Semitism pre-war. He was a person who was a very prominent theologian and community leader and the senior pastor at the Cornerstone Baptist Church, known for his anti-Semitism and his conspiracy theories. Remember where we started about conspiracy theories? Well, William Bell Riley was one, although he tended to equate Judaism and communism, and that was his frequent point of his discussions from his pulpit in downtown Minneapolis. But we've come a long ways, and part of the measure of coming that distance is, this is fun. I'm a huge University of Minnesota sports fan. Bobby Marshall, who was first African-American male attorney in the Twin Cities, was both African-American and Jewish, actually, and he was a great athlete amongst everything else. And there was a nice piece in the Star Tribune about him a couple, 2-3 weeks ago. But as a way to end, here's a story, again, indulging the personal. Jerry Eugen was a banker for Norwest Bank, which eventually became U.S. Bank, which was unusual for the day. Someone from the Jewish community involved in banking. But remember, we talked about Carrie McWilliams, 1945, 1946, anti-Semitism capital of the United States. Jerry in 1973, who was involved in all sorts of civic organizations and good deeds, you might say, was elected or named the Commodore of the Minneapolis, the Aquatennial, of course, our great civic celebration. So there it is, from 1946, discriminated against and marginalized in so many ways, to 1973, the Aquatennial, the Jewish Commodore, about 27 years. It shows you the great distance with which the Jewish community traveled in that generation. One more slide. Now, what does the JCRC do today? Here we are, I'm about an hour into my talk, but so much of our agenda, thankfully, has changed to far more proactive and positive work on behalf of so many different communities and organizations. And commend our website to you, as well as our annual report. You can see Mr. SCHEINER right up here again, and Abi Salam Adam, my dear friend from the Somali community. And after 80 years, we have a wonderful staff, a great team. Thank you, Anthony and Sammy. I'd like to brag on our JCRC team that we have over 100 years of experience collectively together, and that's amongst 9 people. We have an incredible speakers bureau. We're 3 states. We work in the watershed of the Mississippi River and the Red River and the Missouri River. I don't know how many square miles that drains, but it's 225,000 square miles overall. So we're very proud to serve. On behalf of our board chair, Judy Cook, our entire community, thank you to the Linden Hills Study Group. It's history study group, so very important that we study the history of our community, which is fascinating, alternatively frustrating, difficult, beautiful, dangerous, all things above. I'll finish by noting that this is the 100th anniversary this past year of the lynching of the 3 Duluth circus workers in 1920, and a commemoration in which the JCRC is deeply involved. So we need to remember our past. Civil rights remains a significantly important event. All we have to do is witness the George Floyd murder and its aftermath. There's plenty of work for all of us to do together in the community, but there's also important signs of hope upon which we must cling, if not more, seize, because that's the way forward for a better community for everyone. So thank you. Good night. Look forward to answering your questions. Thanks for your patience, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss anti-Semitism and racism and where we've been and where we're going in our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was terrific. If you folks want to unmute, open up your video. If you have questions, comments, let's go for it. So one question, Steve, the big debate that we have had when we were working on this, a very minor point, but anti-Semitism as one word or hyphenated.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Joelle, and thanks to August. Thanks to everyone for participating tonight. Deborah Lipstadt, who is one of the great experts on so many important topics, including her trial back in 1990s, in which she was sued for defamation by David Irving for calling him a Holocaust denier. You may have seen the movie Denial about 3, 4, 5 years ago. She was our speaker at our JCRC annual event in 2019. She makes a case that it should be all one word with a small a, Antisemitism. Who am I to argue with Deborah Lipstadt? So from here on in, anti-Semitism, one word, small a. Great semantic way to start the questioning, Joellen.
Yeah. Okay.
Steve, Larry Lockman here. First of all, thank you. I have 3 things. One brief. In 1971-72, when I was early on the faculty at the university in the medical school, I went to a chairman and asked for a minor favor, space, a little lab stuff. And he looked at me and said, no. And then he said, you people are all alike. 1971, 72. So it was there. I think The reason that history doesn't rhyme is because it's in Aramaic and it's on the first syllable and not the last. There are two articles that I recently read that I commend to you. I thought were very important. One is about the demonstrations in Portland, Oregon, because of course, it's primarily about people who are white supremacists demonstrating. And of course, among the people that they are attacking are us. And the other long article is about where the Republican Party is going. And I was unaware of how intertwined in their whole history is anti-Semitism and of course against African Americans. So excellent articles. You don't have to agree with everything, but worth thinking about. Thank you again.
What was the article? Can you cite it again, Larry?
I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, what was it in though?
They're in the New Yorker, the
Oh, right.
November 2nd New
Sure.
Yorker magazine. It has a big flag kind of thing on the cover, and I gave it to a friend.
Okay, well, we can come up.
Thank you, Larry. Hope you got the email I sent you the other day. You sent me an email and I responded. Did you get my email?
I did. Thank you very much for that. Yes, we could talk about that sometime, maybe privately when you could drink coffee not far away again.
Yeah, I look forward to that time. You talk about history of Mount Sinai Hospital, University of Minnesota Medical School, or Jews involved in medical practice and the issues that we faced. A wonderful book is Fred Lyon's History of Mount Sinai Hospital. Fred, people may have known Fred who are part of this call. Fred was a refugee from Nazi Germany. His family came over after the Kristallnacht. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, probably April, May, June 1939, amongst the last two escapes. Fred was actually supposed to go on the kinder transport, but towards the end, they were able to secure visas and the whole family was able to leave. I don't think I'm talking at a school. Fred's passed away, as is Naomi, his wife. But on their very last night in Germany, they were having dinner with his first cousins and his aunt and uncle who were unable to leave. Talk about these stories and these poignant stories. It was the last time, of course, they saw their cousins and their aunt and uncle because they were unable to leave. And Fred was always haunted by that story, his last meal with his cousins and his aunt and his uncle. And some of Fred's passion for taking care of people. He was an OBGYN for people who did not know him, came from his own experiences. And he was a University of Minnesota Medical. He was a graduate of the University of Minnesota Medical School. Rivel and Prell, professor emerita at the university, has a wonderful exhibit. You can find it online that she helped curate about the history of anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota, particularly pre-war, and the attitudes of some of the presidents like Lotus Kaufman and the like. And
Yeah.
Dug into the archive and found a lot of unsavory aspects, discrimination against Jews and African Americans, as well as spying on Jewish students and radical students and African American students who were participating in activities thought to be inimical to the university. So there's a lot of difficult history of the university and the Jewish community. On the other hand, particularly post-war, the University of Minnesota was an important engine, path forward for the American Jewish community. Probably within the last 10, 15, 20 years, the Minneapolis Jewish Federation, in one of its periodic surveys of the community, found that something like 75 or 80% of the households in the Minneapolis Jewish community who answered the survey had a graduate of the University of Minnesota. So like so many things, there's a lot of ambivalence, history of discrimination, but also an institution which helped many Jews go on to help many Jews in their careers. My father is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, both as an undergraduate major in chemistry and in the law school. My mom was a dental hygiene graduate in 1953 with her associate degree. I'm a graduate of the University of Minnesota from its law school. So like so many things, there's a lot of nuance to any description of any institution.
Thank you very much, Steve. I just have a quick comment. Tom Gerhardt is my name. And my quick comment is that if it were not for Max Winter and Morris Chalfin and Sid Hartman, Minneapolis would have never had the Lakers first and then the Minnesota Vikings second. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to the Jewish community for having the foresight to bring professional sports to the city. And that's my comment, but a terrific presentation.
Thank you, Tom. I was asked by TC Jewfolk, which is an online Jewish newspaper presence, to write an obituary for Sid Hartman. And I should say, not obituary, a little story about Sid Hartman. And you read my mind because I talked about his role. First of all, in that time, 1950s, you could do such things. His day job was to write his column and write sports for the Tribune. By evening, he was the unofficial general manager for the Minneapolis Lakers. But that was right. Morris Chalfin, Max Winter, that was their team, and Sid Hartman was their general manager. And that experience. Right now, we're to digress a bit. And thank you for being such a patient audience. 60 years. Fall of 1960, what happened in this community? Well, a couple things. One, first of all, speaking of presidential elections and close races, it was Minnesota along with Illinois that put Senator Kennedy at the top, because in Minnesota, the vote count went back and forth all night. And finally, in the early wee hours, it was Minnesota and then eventually Illinois that went for Kennedy and helped him elect president. So that was a very exciting time. Hubert Humphrey was running for re-election, and probably because Humphrey was a Senate candidate who was more popular in Minnesota than Kennedy was, Humphrey's support probably pulled Kennedy across the finish line in Minnesota. But that was also the year that the senators moved from DC to Minnesota, and that was announced in October or November 1960. And the Vikings were announced as a recipient, or Minnesota was announced as a recipient of an NFL franchise. So all these things happened within a few week period, 60 years ago in the fall of 1960, sort of, as you would say, Tom, marking Minnesota's entrance into the big leagues via professional sports. That's a little bit of a crab definition of what big league meant, but it was hugely important for the city and its perspective, or for the Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Two other sports things. One is we have the Timberwolves and the Northwest Racket Club, remember? And the other thing has to do with the Twins. When I think Cal Griffith wanted to sell the Twins, the first customer was Jewish and he refused to sell.
Well, there's some interesting question. She was talking about Harvey Ratner and Marvin Wolfenson, who, of course,
right.
Northwest Tennis and Swim and their clubs, and eventually they purchased the Timberwolves before they sold the Timberwolves to Glenn Taylor. And yeah, there has been a story that they really wanted to buy the Twins, but for whatever reason, Calvin Griffith decided to sell the Twins to the Pohlats. No, I don't know what the attribution is. The last thing we're going to do is attribute anti-Semitism to anyone, but I understand it was a disappointment to Harvey and Marv, may they rest in peace, that they didn't have a chance to buy the Twins.
Well, changing topics just a little bit. When I think about the immigrant experience for those coming from Mexico and then over in Europe, those coming from Africa trying to escape, and you think about the Kinder Transit and how, for a good while, the European countries were stepping up and accepting the immigrants. And yet here in the US, we've once again, been putting the brakes on accepting people from other countries. And so it seems like in many ways, we are not much different than we were back in the 40s.
It doesn't rhyme. It doesn't even rhyme. It doesn't change.
Yeah.
There's a whole long and complicated history of U.S. immigration policy. Certainly when it was necessary for the economic development of the country, 19th century, early 20th century, there was practically no limit on immigration. Exceptions, though, of course. In those days, the disfavored community was the community of the Japanese, Chinese Exclusion Act, late 19th century, early 20th century. Later on, as I may have noted in one of my discussions of Henry Ford, after the First World War, and when paranoia associated with the Russian Revolution surfaced, then we had the immigration quotas against Central European and Eastern European, very strict limit immigration quotas, which significantly impacted the Jewish community in the 1930s when people were looking to leave Germany and then Austria. And there were many places, it became very difficult to immigrate to the United States because of the quotas that were established.
And yet we sit here with the largest footprint. So anyway.
Well, and sort of the postscript to that story is the Displaced Persons Act was passed in 1946, 1947, which allowed people from Europe to immigrate to the United States. A fair number of Holocaust survivors were able to enter the United States in the Displaced Persons Act, although it was subject to a lot of criticism initially because it was somewhat limiting actually towards people who fell into that category who were Holocaust survivors. Eventually, it was liberalized under pressure from President Truman to allow more survivors of the Holocaust and similarly situated people who were victims of discrimination during the Second World War to enter the United States.
How is it determined, like what states or areas they went to? I mean, was it basically having personal connections, or?
That was part of it. Fred and Judy's story, just to talk about Fred, he came to Minnesota, interestingly, because he understood its climate was similar to that of Sweden, and he liked the Swedish climate, and he came here because of it. And that's at least the story that Fred told, maybe slightly apocryphally, because he liked to tell stories, Fred. But yes, there were a number of considerations. One, where you had family connections. Two, the various Jewish communal and welfare organizations, of course, were looking to make sure that Jews were resettled in places where they could have a job, where they might have some family connections. They tried to be strategic in placing people around the country. Years later, Soviet Jews who came over in the first wave in the 1970s and then again in the 1990s, our community, Minneapolis, St. Paul Jewish community, had one of the highest per capita relocation rates in the entire country. We've always had a very philanthropic Jewish community, which mirrors the great philanthropy of the Twin Cities in general. We took in a lot of Russian Jews at that time, many of whom continue to stay here, and we have quite the subsets that have sub-cohort of Russian Jews now in their second generation, third generation in the Twin Cities. And they were escaping the Soviet Union so they could live in a place where they could practice their religion.
So it missed the 1960 end of the era that you're talking about, but you didn't comment on Art Naftalin and his election's impact on the Jews in Minneapolis.
Well, it's a good point, David. Use the story of Jerry Jugend because he was a family friend, and his appointment or his title as the Commodore of the Aquatennial. But I suppose the political equivalent, as you suggest, is Art Naftalin's election of the mayor of Minneapolis, right? If we're talking about a period of time, 1945, Carrie McWilliam writes his article in his description of Minneapolis. Then Naftalin is elected mayor. I'm sorry, I'm not sure the year, 1963, maybe 65, whenever it was, maybe a little bit earlier than that. Suddenly have a Jewish mayor of Minneapolis. So the point's well taken that was a landmark, a milestone in the emancipation of the Minneapolis Jewish community when now you have a mayor elected as mayor of the city.
Yeah, 1961, according to Wikipedia here.
Okay.
So I'm Susie Kanemitsu. Thank you so much for a wonderful in-depth presentation tonight. And my comment and question is, it seems that as human beings, we like to blame people for our problems or the problems of society in general. And especially related to anti-Semitism, do you see a connection between, say, economic difficulties or social unrest in a country or any country, and then an upsurge in discrimination towards Jewish people? That's my question. And then, and then my comment too is that then I think political leaders often, ones that are unscrupulous, I would say, tend to use that as kind of a, what can I say, a crutch to say, yes, all our problems are these things, rather than, I think it tends to be more an abuse of power in general in society. Well, that's my question and comment.
Thank you, Susie. A great question. Economic turbulence or economic uncertainty tends to breed social issues and social disturbances and impact the equilibrium of a society. That usually is a breeding ground for ferment of all sorts, sometimes healthy. Take the New Deal, right? Rightly or wrongly, if you agreed with Roosevelt's policies, it certainly ushered into a whole new period of American life. Much greater government intervention, need for far more involvement in government life, and WPA and programs such as those. I mean, go on and on talking about the FDR. The point is that the ferment caused by the Depression, or I should say the need for addressing the Depression, brought about change in the United States. It can also have its negative impacts too. Look at the New Deal period, look at the 1930s, the rise of people like Father Coughlin, who on one hand saw himself as quite the social reformer and one who was trying to champion what he called social justice, but he also laced it with a good deal of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories about Jews. And of course, maybe that's how he felt, but he also appreciated the fact that it helped him attract his radio audiences on Sunday. And there was a reason, going back to Susie's point, people appreciate the opportunity to blame someone else for their difficulties. And that's sadly sort of a hard and fast rule of civilization, is the need to blame other people for current woes, right? We see it throughout American history, just going back to the Korematsu case in Japanese internment in the Second World War, that paranoia, that xenophobia, from where did it arise? Well, we had to figure out why it was that we were struggling so at the beginning of the Second World War, particularly at the Pacific Theater. Well, it must be because of Japanese Americans betraying their country, right? Or the potential for Japanese Americans to betray their country. Interestingly, Office of Naval Intelligence from the beginning was telling the FBI and other institutions of government that it just simply was not true. The Japanese Americans posed practically no threat to the United States, but people found out that it was, to their best interests, often to their economic interests, to support discrimination against Japanese Americans. So there, in times of trouble, people are often willing to label other people, to discriminate against other people, sometimes for all sorts of nefarious reasons. Earl Warren was the Attorney General of California during the Japanese internment, something that he was very ashamed about. Years later, of course, he's 1948. He's Dewey's running mate against Truman, and then he's ultimately appointed to the United States Supreme Court, from where he becomes, author of so many, or his court was the author of so many important civil liberties decisions for the United States. But he was tainted in a way because of his participation as the the Attorney General of California in the Japanese internment. And it was primarily a federal endeavor. Nevertheless, Earl Warren was not without his responsibility for the Japanese internment too.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. And thank you, Steve, so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you, Joellen. Appreciated the opportunity to speak. And everyone should be well, okay?
Be well. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Good night.